Hello guys, in today's video I wanted to touch upon a very important topic, and that is pod to pod communications. When we create a microservices, we create a multiple many microservices, and we want these microservices to communicate with each other. And in the Kubernetes, when we create a microservice, when we start the microservice, it goes into some kind of pod, right? And these pod have a special way of communicating with each other, and we want to understand that how these communication happen in this video. So in a one of the previous video also I said that the pod is created. When the pod is created, it is been assigned a unique IP address in the cluster. Cluster is, in a very simple way, you can say group of pod. And this pod, when it is created, it is isolated from the outer world. It doesn't know anything, and other pod also may not be knowing anything about this pod. In a previous video, we have understood that to expose this pod to so some outside entity, we need to create the service, and service is the best way to make the pod communicate with outer world. And we know that when pod is deleted, this IP address that pod has been assigned is also been deleted. So when we spin up the pod again, this pod will have a new IP address. Here we will be focusing on two type of communication that between pod and pod to pod happens. Let's say we have got a multiple pod defined in the same deployment object. So how the communication will happen when we have defined multiple pods in the same deployment object. Another thing that we also want to learn is how multiple pods define in a separate deployment object. So I created two deployment object, and I have pod in each of these deployment objects. So I wanted to know that how the communication with each other will happen. Let us jump into the application that I have created. So there are two applications I have created, Iron Fist and Red Hood. Both are very similar applications. So what I am trying to do is, from Iron Hood applications, I want to call Red Hood applications URL that is defined in the Red Hood. And from the Red Hood, I want to call the Iron Fist application, the one that is defined. So if you look at it, this is the simple Spring Boot applications which uses a Spring Boot starter, and it uses the actuator, but we, for the purpose of this demo, we don't need a actuator. And in the controller, if you look at it, there is one API that is calling buddy, and calling buddy, what it is doing is it is calling the URL of the Red Hood, and in the application.property file I have defined the Red Hood URL. This is the Red Hood application which is running on the 8082, right? And similar to this one, I have created a Red Hood application which is also a very similar application which uses the Spring Boot starter web. And again in the application.property file which is using the URL of the Iron Fist, right? And Iron Fist is running on the 8081. And if you look at the controller, this is also calling buddy, and that is calling the URL of the Iron Fist, and URL has been defined like this as a value property. Let's start this application locally and see how it runs. I'll start both the application, and let us wait for both applications to get started. So the first one is started. Let us see the other one, and both has been started. So let's go to the Postman and see what happens. So I'm hitting the API of Iron Fist calling buddy, and I get the string Red Hood. Similarly, if I hit the API of the Red Hood calling buddy, I get the string Iron Fist. So locally the communication is happening without any problem. I have stopped both the applications now, and let us go into the Kubernetes pod to pod communications. So you may be aware that when we want to use the images, it needs to be pushed to the central registry. For creating a image, I already have prepared a Docker file, and you can use this Docker file for creating an image and pushing it to the central registry. And you can use any central registry you like. I am using a Docker Hub. Let us try to understand when two pods are defined in the same deployment object. I have created Kubernetes manifest file, and this manifest file, if you look at it, it is deployment object, having deployment object and the service object. In the deployment objects, if you go further down, I have created two containers, that is a pod Iron Fist pod and Red Hood pod. Iron Fist pod is using the image Iron Fist version 1, and Red Hood is using the image Red Hood version 1. Iron Fist is exposing the pod 8081 and Red Hood is exposing the pod 8082. And if you remember, I was using in the Iron Fist, I was using the property file URL Red Hood, and this URL, when you want to define into a manifest files, all the dots that we use has to be replaced with a underscore, and it has in the property file has to be capitalized. So if you look at this, this is my property file, right? URL Red Hood, and all the dots has been replaced with a underscore, and this has been capitalized. So this is my environment variable, the way we have to define it like this. Right? Similarly, I am using the URL of the Iron Hood in the Red Hood, and same way URL Iron Hood has been defined into Red Hood pod. Right? Now if you look at the URL, this URL is using the localhost, right? Localhost 8082, that is of the Red Hood, and localhost 8081, and that is of the Iron Fist. So both are using the localhost URL. And yes, this is correct, because when we define two separate pod into same deployment objects, both can communicate to each other using the localhost IP. It doesn't need any other IP, because both are inside the same deployment objects. They can smoothly communicate with the help of the localhost. Now let us start and see how it behaves. So the way we start is kubectl apply -f and the file name, that is a k8s deployment.yaml. I will hit enter, and we should be able to see get deployment. So the one deployment is done. Get pods. So there are two pods running, and let's see service. So there are two services also started. One is Iron Fist and the Red Hood. Let me clear it. Let us go back to the Postman and see how it is working. So I am calling buddy from the Iron Fist, and I am able to get the string Red Hood. Similarly, I am calling buddy from the Red Hood, and I am able to get Red Hood string. So we are able to make the communication between two pods when we define both the pods with a local host into the same deployment objects. So I hope you understood what I am trying to explain you. So communication between two pods uh, when both pods are defined in the dep same deployment objects can happen using the local host, right? So that is it for deployment object uh, when both the pods are defined in the same deployment object. So now next one is we want to understand when both the pods are defined in the separate deployment object. So thank you very much for watching this video. In the next video we will try to understand how the communication happens when both the pods are defined in the separate deployment object.